What's up, guys? True Techno Gamer back at it, and we have more gaming stuff, and we got to talk about the other side, right? We talk Team Green, we got to talk Team Blue or Team Purple, Amethyst. Okay, well, Sony and AMD, some of you guys may know, have already talked about it and announced that they have a deep partnership, basically designing and planning the next generation of graphics, obviously for the next PlayStation console. And primarily, but also for AMD's, next generation GPU architecture that will impact more than just PlayStation. They kind of put out a video, an official 8-minute, heavily scripted video, but basically to announce some updates to their partnership and basically announce 3 key new additions that are coming to next generation AMD hardware, which of course will power the PS6, the next PlayStation, right? They're not calling it PS6 yet, I'm just saying, but we know what it is. Now, I thought it'd be interesting and kind of fun to play back that video because it's only 8 minutes long. And I'm going to just kind of stop and offer some insights and some commentary because it's really interesting to look at the wording that they use. And I'm going to translate kind of like, okay, this is really what it means. This is really what they're saying. And in terms of the things that they announce, I'm going to also kind of decode those things as well. Okay, so you have a clear understanding of what's happening here. But before we get into that, let's just take a minute, man. Let's just take a step here because it's really interesting the fact that, this console, this PS6, is again rumored to not be launching until fall of 2027 at least. So it's about 2 years out. And we don't usually, everything is usually very secretive and under wraps when it comes to console development. Why are they doing this, right? We got to understand this. I'm going to set the stage here. Why are they doing this? Again, first of all, these technologies that they're talking about are not about PlayStation 6 alone, right? They are clearly going to be a part of the PlayStation 6 story, but they're not about PlayStation 6 alone. In an interview with Digital Foundry, Mark Cerny basically said, right, as much. He said this. He said, in the past, talking about past generations of PlayStation, they've developed some cool technologies perhaps, but it was pretty limited in who can actually use them or access them and who had like full reign to play with them and explore them and optimize for them. Typically, that was Sony first party studios. We saw the likes of Naughty Dog and Sony Santa Monica and Guerrilla Games, pushing the PS3 and even the PS2 and PS4 to levels that third parties generally couldn't reach, right? Even though they may have technically had access to the tools, but they didn't have, full visibility and full knowledge of what the intricacies of the hardware were really about. The intent here with PS6 is to kind of undo all of that, it seems, right? Sony recognizes that we are now in a world where building some bespoke hardware that is going to be limited and only developed to run specific games, it's only going to run in that platform, is kind of the way of the dinosaur now, to say the least, right? If they do have exclusives next gen, I think they're going to be really few and far in between, right? They're basically acknowledging that their games, even their first party studio games, are going to be at least running on PCs regularly. So they need to treat PC as a first-class citizen. So it's not as much of a porting job. It should be pretty seamless to build something for PS6 and for PC. In the PS5 era, where we started seeing these PlayStation games go to PC, it was still a porting job. And in some cases, it was well done. In some cases, it was not. But in general, it was still harder than you think. Porting a PS5 game to PC wasn't easy, accounting for all of the custom hardware and the I/O stuff, and porting that to PC wasn't easy. So we saw that. Obviously, developers are getting more familiar with that now. But clearly the intent for PS6 generation is to remove as many of those barriers as possible. So they're announcing these technology. These are AMD technologies that are going into AMD architecture, right? And they're announcing it because they know the world is going to know, Microsoft is going to know, and NVIDIA is going to know, and Intel is going to know, and whatever. And this is not a mystery. This isn't a secret. That's what they're saying. This isn't a secret, right? We want you guys to know about this stuff, right? Because we want you guys to start thinking about how to leverage this stuff and how to use it to optimize games for the next generation. How do you build a cost-effective console solution that can push performance forward? And the answer is not with larger GPUs and more raw horsepower. It's with neural technologies. It's with machine learning, acceleration, right? And it's with pushing ray tracing and path tracing to really generate much higher fidelity images. It's not a mystery. Again, we've been living this already in the PC space, and NVIDIA's been pushing this stuff for years now, right? So now AMD and Sony are acknowledging we're on board, and we've been working together to make sure that we do this right and that it runs efficiently in any AMD hardware, which ultimately is good for everybody, right? Sony acknowledges if AMD gets it right and it runs well on everything that uses AMD hardware, including Xbox, including PC, including handhelds and whatever, right? That ultimately developers are going to be more inclined to take advantage of it and optimize for it, which means we're going to see better games on PlayStation as well. Clearly are acknowledging PC is a first-class citizen, and quite frankly, they're treating it as an extension almost of the PlayStation. This is a really big paradigm shift, guys, right? So with that said, let's look at the video. And like I said, I'll highlight some points and we'll talk about what the announcements were and then we'll wrap it up.
We've been working on some seriously cool gaming tech with Sony, and I couldn't think of a better person to walk us through it than my good friend, Mark Cerny. Mark, thank you so much for coming out to Austin.
My pleasure.
I've asked Mark to join me to pop open the box and give you a peek at some of the gaming breakthroughs we've been working on together behind the scenes.
Yes, we've been busy, that's for sure. So today it seemed like it might be fun to share a bit about the brand new technologies being developed, starting with our collaboration under Project Amethyst to create the machine learning technologies of the future.
As every gamer knows, it takes a complex set of system expertise to get your setup and games to deliver the highest possible experience. As we progress together, the future brings us to real-time physics, cinematic lighting, efficient asset streaming, and keeping everything in sync across a CPU and GPU with super low latency. Trying to brute force that with raw power alone just doesn't scale. That's why we're combining traditional rasterization with neural acceleration. Okay,
bing, bing, bing. There it is, guys. Trying to achieve what he just mentioned before, cinematic lighting and the fast IO or, efficient data streaming, all of that stuff, trying to achieve that with brute force alone doesn't scale. What he basically is saying there, translation, he's reiterating and admitting Moore's law is dead. We are not going to just get more performance by increasing clocks and increasing shader counts and, all of that stuff and doubling, tripling, multiplying by some factor X the number of shader cores or the amount of memory bandwidth and anything like that. It's not happening. It's not going to scale. So we got to think outside the box. We got to be innovative. We got to find ways to get better, more effective performance, even if the actual physical hardware doesn't really grow that much. Forget the just growing of a GPU or CPU. We got to start thinking differently. And of course, the answer they believe is machine learning as an accelerant, as he said, an acceleration factor for traditional rendering and graphics.
And machine learning isn't just a neat trick anymore. It's become a real tool for developers. Smarter pipelines, cleaner visuals, smoother gameplay, and more headroom to create the worlds we want to all get lost in. And that's what FSR is all about. FSR and PSR actually come from deep co-engineering between Sony and AMD. Co-engineering the neural networks that power both technologies. And going forward, more and more what you see on screen, the detail, the fidelity, the atmosphere, it will be touched or enhanced by ML.
Okay, so that's something that some people kind of feel different ways about, but basically has been the message, particularly from NVIDIA for a while now, right? Which is to say, we're going to see more pixels being rendered by AI, right? We're not going to see native pixels as much anymore. AMD and Sony are basically co-signing that and saying, yep, that's true. We're going to start doing that too. We're going to see, obviously super resolution. We're going to see frame generation. We're going to see neural denoising and all of that stuff that NVIDIA already has and has had in some cases for a while now. But they're basically saying, yep, we're going to do that. You're going to see that. We're going to see machine learning used as the accelerant. Machine learning is basically now the replacement for more hardware, getting that brute force hardware. That's basically what they're saying. And again, we've already seen what this kind of can look like, mostly from NVIDIA over the past few years.
And that means we're not just hitting new technical benchmarks. We're getting closer to the vision of the artists and creators behind the games.
And the challenge comes in how we implement these systems. The neural networks found in technologies like FSR and PSSR are incredibly demanding on the GPU. They're both computationally expensive and require speedy access to large amounts of memory.
So, just keep in mind where Sony is coming from this. Again, these aren't new revelations or new problems. Sony in particular probably recognized these problems when they were still developing the base PS5. Why is this relevant in this context? Of course, this is AMD and Sony. They're going to obviously be talking mostly about the GPU side of things here, because they're talking about rendering. Sony recognizes that in order for them to really address the issues, they need AMD. AMDs are the one that built these chips. They are the experts in that. Sony has done a lot of work to customize and tweak things, but they're not AMD in terms of being able to build the GPU from the ground up and mass produce it, right? So they need AMD to actually build these things, but they're trying to influence AMD to say, these are the types of things you need to address. This is where, graphics needs to go. This will enable our next generation PlayStation, but also this is important and relevant for all platforms going forward for the future of graphics.
The nature of the GPU fights us here. It's made up of a large number of compute units, and problems are therefore typically broken up into bite-sized pieces to enable the individual compute units to tackle them. And there's a downside to that. Subdividing a problem can cause inefficiency, or even force us to give up and find a different approach.
That last piece, that's actually what happened a couple times, right? Sony's saying, hey, we were bumping our head on this thing, trying to figure out, we keep hitting these bottlenecks, right? Because performance is just tanking on these architectures. And again, they can look at a simulation that says, yeah, we took the PS5 and can make the GPU 10 times larger. Yeah, we can get there. We can hit path tracing at 60. But again, that's nowhere near feasible. So, we have to stop and really rethink the overall architecture for these GPUs and how they're going to function in the world of AI and ray tracing and path tracing, right? And, I think that at several times they were like, we need to just do something completely out of the box. If this had been Sony of 20, 30 years ago with Ken Kutaragi, you best believe that he would have came up with some crazy, custom bespoke design to address this, because that's kind of what his way and that was the way of things at the time. But that's not feasible now. And Sony in particular knows that. And they don't want to isolate themselves in this PlayStation island next generation. That's clear by the fact that they're even putting this video out right now, 2 years before the console even drops. All right, they want to make sure that their technologies, things that are going to benefit them, is also going to be spread on everybody else that's using the same technology. They're still using x86 and AMD technology because it's going to make getting their games on other platforms easier, particularly PC. Wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing PlayStation games on other consoles as well. We'll see. But either way, this should help make it easier and more efficient.
Exactly. And that challenge got us thinking. And what came out of it is something we're calling neural arrays. Here's the idea. Instead of having a bunch of compute units all working on their own, we built a way for them to team up, to actually share data and process things together like a single focused AI engine. Now, we're not linking the entire GPU into one mega unit. That'll be a cable management nightmare. But we are connecting CUs with each shader engine in a smart, efficient way. And that changes the game for neural rendering. Bigger ML models, less overhead, more efficiency, and way more scalability as workloads grow.
So it's interesting that they're thinking ahead with this, right? So the first thing, there's 3 key points here. We're going to talk about it, but the first thing is neural arrays. Neural arrays is basically a performance, it's just performance play. It allows for larger AI models, which will enable new types of machine learning solutions. The PS5 Pro doesn't probably have the horsepower, the capability to actually process in terms, the size of the model that it would take to do something potentially like ray reconstruction, right? Or neural denoising, right? Or neural radiance caching, for example, right? These kind of things take a certain level of machine learning, hardware that and capability that the PS5 Pro probably is not very adept at doing. Even with, it's not just the TOPS rating, but again, the bandwidth, what they'll talk about, and the bottlenecking and latency that they're seeing in between cores as data has to keep getting transferred from one CU to the next CU, or that kind of thing. So yeah, this is going to enable performance that will make running all types of, again, the types of neural solutions that we're used to today, that we already see in DLSS, right, and from NVIDIA. We're going to see, of course, super resolution, frame generation, multi-frame generation, ray reconstruction or neural denoising, potentially something like a neural texture compression, neural radiance caching, and a whole bunch of other stuff that we haven't even heard of yet, right? But in order to do that, they know they needed to address this. And notice they mentioned scalability. So it's not about what's available today, it's about what they're cooking up, what can be available in 5 years. Again, console comes out 2 years, 2027. It's going to be out in the market for 7 to 10 years. So it needs to have some room to scale and be able to add and process new types of neural algorithms, going forward. And they need something like this to really ensure that that's possible.
Neural arrays will allow us to process a large chunk of the screen in one go, and the efficiencies that come from that are going to be a game changer as we begin to develop the next generation of upscaling and denoising technologies together.
And when they say the next generation of upscaling, again, I don't know for sure, but basically what he's alluding to is the fact that they want to move to a transformer model, which NVIDIA has recently done with DLSS 4, right? Transformer model is a larger model. It requires more machine learning processing capabilities, okay? And basically what he's saying is that, yeah, we need something like this to be able to even dream of running that on a console, right? Because you simply can't do it now, right? So that's a nugget, right? Like he said that there, but if you're not paying attention, you missed it. But basically, they're thinking about that, and they want to see a transformer-like model that has even higher quality upscaling capabilities, as well as machine frame generation and all that kind of good stuff, similar to what we just saw in the evolution of DLSS, accumulating with DLSS 4.
With neural arrays, we're unlocking a whole new level of performance for ML, not just faster, but more capable. That means better FSR, better ray regeneration, and brand new ML power features we're just starting to imagine.
Okay, so better FSR. Of course, AMD is thinking about it from a standpoint of FSR. What is better FSR? They finally hit the machine learning capability, again, using a more advanced model like a transform model, maybe something else, but something that's going beyond the CNN model for sure, right? He pointed out, right, ray reconstruction. He specifically pointed that out. And that's an important piece. That does wonders for a lot of these path trace games that we've seen coming from the NVIDIA side, right? So that's pretty cool. They're going to have that. Pretty sure they're aiming to get that in there by launch.
And all working in real time, right on the GPU. And we're just getting started. As we look ahead, you also see dedicated innovations that bring cinematic rendering to an entirely new level.
Another area we've been focusing on has been ray tracing. When I look at its broad usage on PlayStation 5 for reflections, shadows, and global illumination, it's difficult to believe that it's been just 5 years since ray tracing was introduced.
Definitely, Mark. And now with path tracing becoming more central to real-time graphics, the demands on GPU just continue to grow.
All right, so before nugget, before they get into this, right? Mark Cerny just flat out said, another area we've been focusing on is ray tracing. So the focus for next gen, we're going to see large jumps in ray tracing performance. They clearly believe that that's the future. Path tracing, obviously, is the evolution of that. You're going to hear them talk a lot more about path tracing. The focus of next gen, the focus of the PS6 is going to be to deliver real-time path trace graphics at high frame rates, right? At 60 FPS. There it is, right? So, right. Anyone wondering, like, no, this is the focus area. This is the point. They need machine learning to deliver that. They need high quality FSR, PSSR. They need frame gen. They need ray reconstruction to deliver that with high quality, right? But keep in mind, guys, because some people have said this, AMD has made a lot of good strides with their architecture going from RDNA 2 to RDNA 4, which is the current model, current version that's out now, in terms of the hybrid ray tracing, right? In hybrid ray tracing terms, they pretty much match NVIDIA now, which is saying a lot because they have trailed NVIDIA for so long by so much, right? So RDNA 4 is a pretty decent ray tracing architecture, but it's still horrible for path tracing, right? They clearly know that. Mark Cerny adopting AMD technology is like, if we're going to get this working in a console form factor for the size and the cost that we need to get rid of these bottlenecks. We need to be more efficient. And that's been the push from them on AMD. So clearly they're focused on that. They're thinking about that, which again benefits everybody. It's going to benefit NVIDIA. It's going to benefit Microsoft and Xbox. It's going to benefit everybody because, developers are going to be pushing much higher fidelity visuals in their games, and they gotta leverage these technologies to do that. So, but when he says that, I mean, there's no more mystery. If anyone's wondering, path tracing and ray tracing is the focal area for next gen, right? Especially, particularly from the PlayStation side.
That's why we've been pushing hard to go beyond the current approach to help developers bring even more realism and cinematic lighting into their games.
But the challenge is that the current approach has reached its limit. To perform ray tracing today, a shader program has to juggle two very different responsibilities. One is ray traversal, digging through complex data structures to locate where the millions of rays being cast hit the millions of triangles in the scene geometry. When there are intersections, that same shader program has to also be doing its usual work of shading the scene, using texture and lighting information and the like.
And we spent the past 2 years rethinking the entire path tracing pipeline from hardware to software. Early this year at Computex, we introduced neural radiance caching, a key part of FSR Redstone. Now, we're building on that with Radiance Cores, a new dedicated hardware block designed for unified light transport. It handles ray tracing and path tracing in real time, pushing line performance to the whole new level. Together, these form a brand new rendering approach for AMD. Radiance Cores takes full control of ray transversal, one of the most compute-heavy parts of the process. And that frees up the CPU for geometry and simulation, and lets the GPU focus on what it does best, shading and lighting. The result? A cleaner, faster, and more efficient pipeline built for the next generation of ray trace games.
Okay. So there it is. The second thing, Radiance Cores is what they call it. It's really interesting how they presented that. This is a brand new approach for AMD in terms of thinking about the pipeline. It is for AMD. It's not in general. Basically what a Radiance Core is, based on how they described it now there's probably a lot more to it and a lot more information to come, but based on what they described it now, when they're talking about it focuses in on the ray, the ray intersection and traversal, calculations, which are really heavy when it comes to ray tracing and path tracing. That has been the bottleneck on AMD hardware today because of what Mark Cerny outlined. The fact that AMD architecture in RDNA 2, 3, and 4 still pretty much do all of the ray tracing calculations within the shader cores. Then they run into issues where, again, they have to share data because the data structures are typically handled on the CPU side, right? So they have to share data between the CPU and GPU. They run into issues there, which is something that they alluded to earlier, okay? But guys, this Radiance core it sounds very much like an RT core from NVIDIA, which NVIDIA introduced back in 2018 with the Turing architecture, the 2000 series cards, the 2080 Ti. That was Turing. That was 7 years ago, right? Welcome to the party, AMD. They're finally catching up. It's still cool because we're going to see that spread across a lot more devices and a lot more platforms. It should give a lot better performance. It should make path tracing much more viable on AMD hardware. But I just want to put that in context. Basically, they're describing the equivalent of an RT core from NVIDIA architecture, right?
There's a significant speed boost that comes from putting the traversal logic in hardware, and a further boost that comes from having that hardware operate independently from the shader cores. On top of those performance increases, there's other features in the works too, such as flexible and efficient data structures for the geometry being ray traced. Overall, I'm really looking forward to the time when we can get Radiance Cores into the hands of game creators.
And we're excited to see how developers push ray tracing and path tracing even further with these tools. And here's the thing, whether it's ML or ray tracing, they both hit the same bottleneck. Current GPU memory bandwidth limitations hinder the seamless adoption of next-gen rendering techniques, requiring significantly more bandwidth to handle 4K plus textures and ray tracing denoising masks for smooth asset streaming. And that's where a final piece of news comes in, and yeah, it's a big one.
With current GPUs, including the ones in PlayStation 5 and PlayStation 5 Pro, we have something called DCC, or Delta Color Compression. It's a strategy that reduces the memory bandwidth consumed when the GPU is reading or writing certain data, such as textures or render targets.
And what we've built for future GPUs and SoCs take the idea of data compression much further. We call it universal compression. It's a system that evaluates every piece of data headed to memory, not just textures, and compresses it whenever possible. Only the essential bytes are sent out, which dramatically reduces memory bandwidth usage. That means the GPU can deliver more detail, higher frame rates, and greater efficiency.
Here too, I'm really looking forward to what improvements universal compression will bring, and to what degree the effective bandwidth of the GPU will exceed its paper spec.
Ding, 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 ding. There it is, guys. That is an important point. That is what this whole thing is really all about. Notice what he said there. He's really excited to see how universal compression can increase the effective bandwidth over its paper spec. The paper spec, guys, is the raw physical brute force numbers. Right, and this is something that PlayStation has always been kind of savvy with, right? We clearly seen that with this generation, PS5 versus Xbox Series. On paper, the Xbox Series was the superior platform, right? It was a superior system. All the numbers looked higher when you looked at the spec. The clock speed was higher on the CPU. The number of CU core, the shader cores were way higher on the GPU. The memory bandwidth number was higher. All of that stuff. And then what did we see? We saw that in practice, the PS5 seemingly punched above its weight and actually delivered more often than not, kind of beat the Xbox Series X in a head-to-head comparison. I would say it was roughly like 2 out of 3 in favor of PS5, 1 out of 3 in favor of Series X. They kind of traded blows, but depending on the workload. But going into the launch of these systems, everyone was like, there's no way the PS5 is so underpowered. There's never going to be Xbox Series is so superior, blah, 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 blah. Mark Cerny and team have always been focused on doing this, but clearly it's a focal point now because they've never hit the limits, the physical limits of what they can do with hardware the way they are hitting them now. They're clearly seeing that, right, with the PS6. So everything, the neural arrays, the Radiance Cores, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff that they obviously didn't talk about yet. But what we're going to see in PS6 is, and people, again, we already have the leaks. We already have some specs. They don't look dramatic, terrible. Like, oh my God, that's going to be a beast. That's not what those numbers show. And that's intentional because Sony wants to build something that is in a world where, again, a PS5 Pro is $750. Right? They want to build something that's still within the realm of comfort for a console, which means somewhere probably at least around the $500 range, $600 range, right? If they're going to do that, they have to be able to scale things down. They have to be able to build things that they can cool, that doesn't use so much power, that's not so big, et cetera, et cetera. The PS5, again, had spent a lot of money on the hardware side trying to cool it. And, it was a big machine, the initial version, right? They want to scale that down, but they still want to deliver the performance that you would expect for a next gen. That's what this whole thing is about. Don't get caught up in the paper specs. Whatever you see, the leaks that are out now and the leaks that will be out next year and whatever the final specs in 2 whatever it is. Don't get caught up in the paper specs. They mean less and less these days with everything I've been saying, that Moore's law is now dead, that machine learning is a thing. It doesn't mean as much. So he said it right there. They're looking at ways to give you an effective bandwidth that exceeds this paper spec. The leaks say that the PS6 is going to only have like 600 and something, I can't remember, 600 and something gigabytes per second. The PS5 Pro has 576. So we're barely looking at 100 gigabytes per second more, right? It's like barely over 10% increase. That sounds anemic, but this is why. This is why they can do that, because what they're trying to achieve here is to say the effective bandwidth out of the system using something like this universal compression stuff and other stuff they probably haven't talked about yet, and a lot of the machine learning stuff. The effective bandwidth when you're actually running a game can be approaching 2 terabytes per second, right? 3, 4, 5 times X, what the paper spec shows. That's the goal. And that's what they're trying to do across the board.
There's a multitude of benefits from this, including lower power consumption, higher fidelity assets, and perhaps most importantly, the synergies that universal compression has with neural arrays and Radiance Cores as we work to deliver the best possible experiences to gamers.
Notice he said lower power consumption, right? A lot of rumors have been pointing to the leaks of Sony that that's their focus. They're not trying to build another PS3. They're not even trying to build another PS5. They want something that's smaller, cheaper to manufacture, where they can see more return, but still deliver that performance. That's their focal point. Unlike Xbox from the leaks, they're going to be building this kind of really big monolithic box that, again, have all the higher numbers on paper. But we'll see what that actually looks like in game. But lower power consumption is a key point for them.
Overall, it's of course still very early days for these technologies. They only exist in simulation right now, but the results are quite promising, and I'm really excited about bringing them to a future console in a few years' time.
A future console in a few years' time. Notice he said a few years. So we're talking PS6. Leak has pointed to fall of 2027. That kind of lines up with what he just said as a few years' time. It could be later, of course, things can change, but I don't think we're going to see it before 2027. So again, Sony is still thinking about building the next PlayStation here, right? It is true that they are thinking beyond that. They're again working closely with AMD. They're putting this out there, knowing that Xbox and Microsoft and Intel and everybody else, Nvidia, all is going to hear this stuff, and they're fine with that. This is important core stuff for next gen. But we're still building our next PlayStation box. We're going to leverage this stuff and more. Stay tuned.
We feel the same way, Mark, and we're so excited to bring these innovations to developers across every gaming platform. Because this isn't just about silicon.
Notice what he did there. He literally stopped and slowed down to emphasize every gaming platform. Right? It's there, guys, right? So all of these technologies, people are like, oh, it's this PlayStation stuff. Again, PlayStation they're well aware. This stuff is AMD technology. It's going into AMD hardware. AMD hardware is everywhere. AMD hardware is in mobile. It's in consoles, multiple consoles, right? Xbox, PC, laptops, etc., etc. So this is a play that Sony is actually being able to influence, right? Influence the architecture and influence what the gaming world at large is going to experience. This is PlayStation putting their footprint, putting their fingerprints maybe on the industry at large, right? That's what's happening here, which is kind of crazy given that they always have been so siloed before, right? They're understanding, guys, this is the future. Everybody get on board, right? Because that'll benefit them as well. And AMD is like, if we're going to partner here, right, understand that we're building stuff that is going to be much broader than PlayStation, right? There had to be a stipulation, I'm sure. And, Sony's like, oh, yeah, of course, absolutely, right? We know. So, there it is.
And it's about empowering the creators and communities that make gaming what it is. And we're just getting started. As we continue building with close partners like Sony,
as we continue building with close partners like Sony, which means they're building with other partners. We're going to hear more from AMD and Microsoft, of course, on what they've been doing with Xbox. We're going to hear that, right? And they probably have other partners too, but partners like Sony implies there's multiple partners out there. They're doing a lot. So this is not just about Sony. This is not just about this site, kind of relatively small group of technologies that they help develop. With Sony, their RDNA 5 architecture has a lot to it, and a lot of influence is going to come from Microsoft, I guarantee you, as well as other players as well.
What we're doing is focus on one thing, pushing games forward for all of you. Gaming has always been at the heart of what we do, and it's never meant more than it does right now. We're here for the players, the creators, and the communities that make this industry matter. And everything we're building is for you. Thank you, Mark, so much for taking time to join me here today.
Thank you, Jack.
All right, so there you have it, guys. It was an interesting talk. The three key things that they talked about and announced, here it is. So neural arrays, and they put it right there. It's a performance play, like I said. Radiance Cores, they're saying it's about immersion because it's basically about path tracing, ray tracing and path tracing. And then universal compression, which is about efficiency. All of these things are specific bottlenecks that Mark Cerny in particular had already called out on the PS5 and the PS5 Pro in terms of being a bottleneck for delivering a lot more machine learning capability and again being able to reach high quality ray tracing and path tracing, right? So they are addressing that. They're making this known and available to everybody. AMD again is working with multiple people. They have a partnership with Xbox as well. Xbox have announced that. I'm pretty sure you're going to hear more about what's going on with Xbox and AMD soonish, right? And but yeah, it's a different paradigm. It's a different world we're going to be in next gen for sure. PC is obviously from both Microsoft and Sony at least is going to be treated as, again, a first-class citizen, right? Microsoft is building supposedly this hybrid console that basically is a PC in a console form factor to put in your living room, but it's basically a PC, integrating all of your PC library and stuff like that into this one place, which, could be pretty compelling. And then Sony, is building technology that's going to be front and center, available to PC developers so that those PlayStation 6 games run great and are easy to develop and port to the PC, right? They're going to obviously have some other custom stuff, that remains to be seen what that is. I think a lot of it is going to be more in the experience side of things as opposed to just the pure technical side of things. Again, PS5 was about the Tempest engine with the 3D audio. It was about the DualSense with the haptic feedback, that kind of stuff, right? The SSD with the super fast loading, those kind of things, right? Not just raw power. I don't know what that is right now, but I think we're going to see some things like that where the experience on PS6 is taken to another level via some technologies, right? So, I'm excited. Ultimately, this is good for the industry. I worry what it's going to mean to the cost and the time of development. These things are not easy. They're really not trivial. So if games are already taking an insane amount of time and money, figuring out how to build a neural network to do, X, Y, Z to a game is just like, is that going to even, make it that much longer? That's not sustainable. So I hope not. Right. But that's a real problem that I think, the industry has to solve and developers have to solve. So, and platform holders have to solve as well. So there it is, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments. What did you think of this presentation? What are you feeling about the PS6 right now? It's going to be interesting, guys. So stay tuned. Till next one, True Techno Gamer signing off.